Hello friends, a quick disclaimer before today's video. I'm sitting here at 1:07 in the morning and realized that I made an error on today's video. Almost always when I use contract information, I will go to over the cap because they are by far and away the most accurate. For whatever reason, when I looked up Yosh Nijman's contract, I went to Spotrac this time and they had him listed as an unrestricted free agent. He is actually a restricted free agent this upcoming season. Over the Cap has it correct. I know Ken Ingles has him listed as a restricted free agent as well. Thankfully, I noticed it before this episode went live, but the majority of today's conversation is going to be based specifically on Elgton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari. There is a portion on Yosh Nijman in which I talk about him being an unrestricted free agent and a couple different contract options that could be there for Yosh. But he, in fact, is a restricted free agent, not an unrestricted free agent. And Green Bay will have basically three options of which they can place on him. A first-round tender, which would be a one-year, $6 million deal. A second-round tender, which would be a one-year, $4.3 million deal. Or a right of first refusal, which would be a one-year, $2.6 million deal. Those are projected tenders by Over the Cap. With Yosh, I would be willing to bet that they would put a second round tender on him, giving him a one-year, $4.3 million deal, and then potentially work towards a longer term deal. But you can feel pretty confident that Yosh will very likely be on this team in 2023, which changes a couple of the conversation points today and could potentially make it a little bit maybe more likely that they could keep at least more than one of these players, with talking about Yosh, Elgton, and David Bakhtiari. But potentially making it that they have Yosh on the roster, so maybe one of Bakhtiari or Elgton could become more expendable. You will see what I'm talking about as the episode goes along, but I wanted to address that up front. I apologize for the error that you will hear moving forward, but just to be clear one more time, Yosh in 2023 is a restricted free agent, very likely to be back, and almost certainly going to be back on that second round tender, one-year, $4.3 million deal, unless they can come to an agreement on a long-term deal prior to that. So hope you enjoyed today's episode. Apologize again for the error. I will see you guys tomorrow, but enjoy the rest of the episode and go Pack Go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack-A-Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at AndyHermanNFL. Today, we are going to be talking about the state of the Packers offensive line and, much more importantly, some huge decisions that the Packers are going to have to make on the offensive line this upcoming offseason. And before we get started, I just want to say, I get we are in the middle of the 2022 season, and while it is bleak and disappointing, we're not going to get to the point where every episode is just about 2023. We're going to continue to talk about this year's team, but I've been asked a lot of questions about these specific players that we're going to be discussing today and the future of the Packers offensive line. And I do believe that this is a tremendously interesting topic. And I think it's going to be a huge decision for this front office and what they do moving forward. And there's going to be a lot that goes into this decision. So buckle in. It's going to be a big time conversation that there's going to be some really difficult decisions for the Packers front office to make. And I want to go over those options today because I think, like I said, it's really interesting, and I want to get ahead of it because I think this is one of the top topics that we could potentially be talking about right now. So let's start with the current actual state of the Packers offensive line. As you know, left to right, David Bakhtiari, Elgton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Jon Runyan Jr., Yosh Nijman. Since they've made that change, Bakhtiari comes back. They put him back, obviously, at left tackle. They move Elgton Jenkins to left guard. They move Jon Runyan Jr. to right guard. They put Yosh Nijman finally at right tackle. They keep Myers at center. Since that's happened, I've actually liked overall the play of this offensive line. It's not perfect. There's been some ups and downs. Jon Runyan Jr., Josh Myers, Yosh Nijman have been inconsistent, but some flashes of some really good stuff, some flashes of some really bad stuff too, but it's been better. There's been more time to throw. The run blocking a little bit inconsistent. Overall, just inconsistent. Elgton Jenkins has been playing better at left guard, certainly, than he was at right tackle, and David Bakhtiari has still been the best offensive lineman on this team. So I've I've liked how this offensive line has gelled together. Have they been great? No. Have they been one of the league's best offensive lines since that change? No. But they've certainly been better, and they've been serviceable during that time period. Remember that. They've been serviceable to even sometimes good at times with that 5-man offensive line. The rest of the offensive line right now, if you look at this Packers roster, they have Luke Tenuta. Yes, that is a real person. They claimed him a few weeks back. He was a 6th-round pick in 2022 that they claimed off of waivers. They have Sean Ryan, a 3rd-round pick this year. Zach Tom, a rookie this year. Royce Newman, 2nd-year, 4th-round pick. And Rasheed Walker, a 7th-round pick this year. They have nobody on their practice squad currently. They have Jake Hansen on injured reserve. And they have Caleb Jones on the non-football injury list. Don't ask me what's up with Caleb Jones. I have no idea. I haven't heard anything. I know he went out with an illness at some point, went on the non-football injury list, and has yet to come back. So hopefully he's doing okay, but we have not heard anything on Caleb Jones as of late. So that is where the current Packers offensive line stands at this moment. So again, Bakhtiari, Jenkins, Myers, Runyon, and Nyman starting. Tenuta, Ryan, Tom, Newman, and Rasheed Walker as depth that is on the 53-man roster right now. No practice squad, Hansen on IR, Caleb Jones on the non-football injury list. So then let's get to next season, because at some point, probably sooner rather than later, probably in 6 games, this season's going to come to an end. And they're going to have to make, like I mentioned, some very serious decisions along the offensive line. So next season right now, under contract, David Bakhtiari, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Luke Tenuta, Sean Ryan, Zach Tom, Royce Newman, Rasheed Walker, and Caleb Jones. That's 9 guys that are on their 53-man roster or on, the non-football injury list in the case of Caleb Jones right now. So they get 9 of those guys still under contract. But 3 players have become free agents. Jake Hansen is a restricted free agent. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Jake Hansen today because that is clearly not the crux of today's topic. But just really quick, Jake Hansen is a restricted free agent, and he is set to make, if they give him the right of first refusal tender, and these are estimated per over the cap, but likely would be a 1-year, $2.629 million deal. So basically 1 year, $2.6 million deal for Jake Hansen. Let's just state very clearly, they would not do that. So they would not tender him with any sort of restricted free agent tender, which would make him an unrestricted free agent. I think based on this point, with all of the young players that they have on the roster, I think they're probably just going to say, hey, we're going to move on from Jake Hansen. We're not going to tender him, and we're just going to let him go to another team. Is it possible they could bring him back if he doesn't have any interest on a 1-year minimum deal and have him compete in camp? Yes. But again, clearly this is not about Jake Hansen and whether or not they bring him back on a minimum deal. Odds are he's not on the team. Even if he does come back on a minimum deal, the odds that he actually makes the 53-man roster next year, probably not great. So we're going to leave Jake Hansen right there as probably not part of any of the future Packer plans. And if he is part of the Packers' future plans and ends up actually playing serious snaps next year, that is probably a major problem anyway. So we're not even going to go over that scenario. So Jake Hansen, for all intents and purposes, is out of this conversation, and we're going to expect that he's probably not back on the roster next year, which leaves 3 players, all of great interest. Elgton Jenkins, who is an unrestricted free agent, Yosh Nijman, who is an unrestricted free agent, and David Bakhtiari, whose contract is very, very interesting, and Green Bay is going to have to make a decision on. So, if we were just to take a look right now at what the potential starting lineup could look like based on the players that are on the roster under contract right now and what that could look like, what the depth could look like. Clearly there's free agency, there's draft, and they can sign players back. But right now you'd probably be looking at a starting lineup of David Bakhtiari at left tackle, Zach Tom at left guard, Josh Myers at center, John Runyon Jr. at right guard, and then you probably have an open competition between Rasheed Walker, Caleb Jones, Royce Newman at right tackle. Not great. You have Bakhtiari back, which is good. Zach Tom looks like he could be an adequate starter at some point, and especially if he's able to put on some functional strength. Myers and Runyon are already your starters, and then right tackle would probably be a major issue that you'd have to address, probably with a rookie. You could probably get by with that. If they just wanted to say, hey, we're going to draft a rookie in the first or second round to probably play right tackle. We've got a couple other guys that can compete. and we're going to lean on Myers and Runyon and Zach Tom to get better and hopefully guys like Sean Ryan, Royce Newman to get better, to really add depth and just get better on the interior of the offensive line. They could theoretically go in that direction and just say, Yosh Nijman, Elgton Jenkins, we're going to move on, and that's going to be our roster right now. But again, there are going to be some major decisions that they have to make. The first thing is that we're not going to get into it all today because we don't have the ability to go too deep. Otherwise, it's going to be like a 3-hour video. We'll get to it on another date, I promise. But the salary cap is going to be a major issue again for the Packers. Can they kick some things down the line again? Can they, spread deals out and add some void years and do all the salary cap gymnastics that they've done the last couple of years? Yes, they can. But the more and more that they kick things down the road, year after year after year, the more that well starts to dry up, and it really puts you behind the 8 ball. So either way, though, they are going to have some salary cap issues, and they're going to have to be careful with what type of money they put into next season, even if they spread it out to future seasons. So that is going to play a factor. And then the biggest thing that is going to play a factor in these decisions is, are they going to try one more time to keep this window open for Aaron Rodgers and make another run at this thing? Because right now, you can make a very strong argument that that answer should be a unequivocal no, that they should not do that. This team it's almost going to be impossible to put together a better roster next year than the talent that they had on the roster this year. And again, we'll save a lot of that conversation for another day, but with the salary cap being an issue, and with a lot of free agents and some really difficult salary cap casualties that there are going to be next year on this team, even if Rodgers is back and all in next season, it is going to be very difficult to put a better roster talent-wise together next year than the one we had this year. And this year went atrociously. Even if they get better marginally, it's still going to be nowhere near the teams that they put together in 2020 or 2021, which capped off at, first round and second roll. Division round and championship round of the playoffs and never got to a Super Bowl. So you can make a very strong argument that they should be very much in the realm of starting their rebuild next year, which would play a major factor in these decisions as well. But if they're deciding that they want to win, then clearly you're more likely to want to make sure you get guys like Elgton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari back, because without them, it's going to be very difficult to win next season. If they decide to go the rebuild mode, then you've got to make a decision. Is Elgton Jenkins part of your more immediate rebuild? David Bakhtiari almost certainly would not be. Is Yosh Nijman a part of that? So all of those are going to have to be decisions. But the first thing that Brian Gutekunst and company are going to have to decide is, are they all in again in 2023, or is it time to take a step back and to start this rebuild a little bit? That's going to have to happen at some point. And very clearly goes without saying that Aaron Rodgers is going to face to be a major part of this, because if he retires, that basically kicks off your rebuild and makes the decision for you. If he comes back and you tell him we're going to rebuild, that's not going to go over very well. Does he ask for a trade? What type of trade value does he have? Can Green Bay afford trading him on the salary cap, which becomes extremely complicated unless they do it after June 1st, which becomes extremely complicated for the team that's acquiring him because they're going to want him before June 1st. So there is a ton of complexity that goes into that as well. So Aaron Rodgers is going to play a major part in this. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about today is the 3 players that they're going to have to make incredibly difficult decisions on in David Bakhtiari, Elgton Jenkins, and Yosh Nijman. Let's start with David Bakhtiari, because I think he's the most interesting one to discuss. It's going to be the most passionate that the fan base is, and it's going to be a very difficult decision and difficult topic to go over. Let me start by saying there are few, if any, players that I have enjoyed watching more than David Bakhtiari in my time as a Packer fan. He is arguably on my Mount Rushmore of favorite Packers, and just watching how he went about his business, practiced, played the game, all of it, watching him go from day 3 draft pick to undeniably best left tackle at one point and best tackle was so fun to watch. And how he mastered his craft and became such a dominant offensive lineman. He was just a joy to watch and it still is a joy to watch on every single game. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, he is still the Packers' best offensive lineman. As we sit here today, there's no question about it in my mind. David Bakhtiari is the Packers' best offensive lineman. He's playing extremely well right now. Is he unequivocally the best tackle in football or even in that conversation right now? No, I don't believe so. But he's really, really good. And like I said, unquestionably the best offensive lineman on this Packers team. That said, the injury issues remain. If I told you tomorrow that David Bakhtiari didn't play this week, that wouldn't take you by surprise for a second because we have no idea on any given week. If I told you that he started the game against the Eagles, felt some discomfort 10 plays in, and didn't play the remainder of the game, that wouldn't surprise you one iota. This is probably the new reality for David Bakhtiari. Now, maybe he makes it through the remainder of this season, doesn't miss a snap the remainder of the year, and looks like he's overcome this. Maybe that possibility exists. Maybe the injury is truly behind him, but that's really tough to say as we sit here today. And even if he makes it through the remainder of the season without one hiccup with his left knee the remainder of the way, or his knee the remainder of the way, there's no guaranteeing that something doesn't flare up in the offseason, that it doesn't flare up in training camp next year, that it doesn't become an issue in sometime in the next 2 years when he's still under contract. So the injury is still going to cloud this decision in a major, major way. Also, he is going to be 32 to start next season. So you look back at some of the Packers' decisions along the offensive line through the years, you start seeing the Packers offensive linemen get into their 30s, and the Packers have more often than not made the decision that they are going to move on in those situations. And now you're talking about a 32-year-old offensive lineman who had missed, more than a full season, missed end of 2020, all of 2021, and then part of 2022 with a major injury, and you're not sure how that's going to respond. Age and injury have to factor into this. So where David Bakhtiari's contract is right now, he has 2 years, $62.1 million remaining on his deal, $31 million per year for the remainder of this contract. So 2 years, $62.1 million remaining on his contract. So you might immediately think, all right, well, there's no way they're going to pay 2 years, $62 million. That's $31 million per year. Like, I don't care who you are. Even if you didn't have injury issues, that's a tough pill to swallow. Maybe that might be what you're thinking. However, $23.1 million of that is guaranteed and paid already, no matter what. They can't get it back. They can't recoup it. They've already paid it. So that is gone. Even if he retires, even if they trade him, even if they cut him, that is David Bakhtiari's money. It is gone. There's nothing you can do about it. So what it amounts to is a 2-year, $39 million non-guaranteed remaining on his contract. If you really break it down and take the guaranteed money that's already paid out, that's what's left. 2 years, $39 million remaining. So the question that Green Bay will have to ask is if David Bakhtiari, in essence, is if David Bakhtiari were a free agent this offseason and he said, I want to come play for the Packers, what it's going to cost you is 2 years, $39 million, non-guaranteed. That's what I want. Would you sign him to that deal? And I say non-guaranteed, but if you sign him and he plays the first game of the regular season next year, that full year will get guaranteed. It gets a little bit complex, but long story short, would you sign him to a 2-year, $39 million deal? And if the answer is yes, then it's an easy answer. Like, you don't do anything with this deal. You just keep him on his contract right now and you move on. And if the answer is no, then you release him and you start going in a different direction. There is one other option. You could keep him in 2023 and then release him in 2024, and you would still save $21.5 million on that deal in 2024. So what that would amount to is basically a 1-year, $17.5 million deal in 2023 to keep him on the roster in 2023 if you wanted to compete for one more season, if Rodgers was going to stay one more season, and then you do still have the option to save some of that money in 2024. So there are a couple different options here, but You have to ask yourself, would you sign him basically either to a 2-year, $39 million deal or at minimum a 1-year, $17.5 million deal? If David Bakhtiari can play like he is right now, 1 year, $17.5 million, even 2 years, $39 million is that's an easy decision. There's no question about it. The way that he is playing, he is worth that contract. But when you have a player who has an injury situation that David Bakhtiari does, let me be as clear about this as possible. If you are answering with your heart, you will obviously say, bring David Bakhtiari back. If you are thinking like an NFL general manager, where every move that you make carries risk reward, the risk reward for this team, for this franchise, to bring him back and to pay that salary for a player who could at any moment play his last snap. And you might make the argument, listen, Andy, at any point, any player could play their last snap. But the odds with Bakhtiari are significantly higher that at any moment he could be done. To move forward with that as a complete unknown is basically general manager malpractice. You can't do that. And I know that that sucks to hear. And I know maybe some of you will be upset with me coming to that conclusion. But if you are putting your general manager hat on, there is just no way that you can commit a huge sum of money to a player whose knee is basically hanging on by a thread. And again, I know that is difficult to hear, and it's not what I want to say. I love watching David Bakhtiari play football, but the smart money is not to bring him back and pay him more money when you just don't know what that return on investment is going to be. And the health issues are extremely serious, and it's just completely unknown. And it is very clear that through this time in Green Bay, and while he's been injured, Green Bay hasn't had a great feel for when he's going to come back, when he's going to play. Even now, like I said, the remainder of the season, we have no idea if he's going to be able to make it through any given game or the remainder of the season, or if he's going to be out this week. We just don't know. And that probably is the new reality for David Bakhtiari. And one of the worst things you could do is, try to go all in one more season, pay David Bakhtiari a bunch of money to come back next year, and the season doesn't work out again, or you end up paying for a ton of money to a player who just can't give you, what are the odds next season that David Bakhtiari makes it through 17 games plus playoffs? If it would get to that point, the odds are just, it doesn't seem great. If I'm just telling you right now, if I were, and thank goodness I'm not, I'd make a lot of dumb decisions, but if I were GM, there's just no way that you can make an honest argument for bringing David Bakhtiari back at that price, which then brings up a few different questions. Would a trade be an option? I can't imagine any GM is looking at that contract and saying, yes, we want to acquire that with the knee injuries that he's had. And especially if Green Bay is looking to move on. I just can't imagine that. Could they maybe pick up a 7th round pick because the team that picked him up would not have to have, any guarantees until he started the season, and they could get him through training camp and reevaluate him? Maybe they could pick up something small. I just don't see it. The other questions are, could there be a restructure? Yeah, there could be a restructure. If Rodgers came back, Bakhtiari wanted to continue to play, and Green Bay went to him with that option, that could be an option, and Bakhtiari might be open to it, knowing where he's at in his career. But what you have to be prepared for is if you go to a player asking him to restructure and he says no, you kind of have to be ready to cut him if he says no at that point. So that becomes a question mark as well. So they maybe could work something out where he takes less money going forward. He might be offended by that after working all the way back and playing really good football. Now that he's back, he might say, I worked all the way back and played great coming back, and now you want me to take less money? That could be an issue. And then another question becomes, how does this affect Aaron Rodgers? And how does Rodgers factor in? If Rodgers says he's coming back, are you going to go to him and tell him you're cutting one of his best friends? His left tackle, his blindside tackle? It's probably not going to go over very well. Mr. It's all about the people. cutting that guy who has worked through hell to get back and playing is probably not going to sit well with Rodgers. It just isn't. So, and that's part of the issue is when you start giving more power to players and having a say in those things, it becomes very awkward. It becomes very complicated. So that becomes an issue. And then as I talked about with Perry Goldstein and Alex Strofe earlier this week, another consideration here is if you are thinking that this is the case, that you very well may want to move on and release him in the offseason, as soon as you're mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, you want to shut him down. Because if he re-injures himself this season and is hurt to start next season, now you've got injury settlements to work through. And you don't want to work through that either. So there is a lot of questions at play here. And then the last one is, could he retire? David Bakhtiari might be at a point of him realizing he can't do this at the level that he wants to be able to do it and play consistently the way that he would want to do it. There's a possibility that he could just say, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. And he could retire as well. That would be well within the realm of possibility, especially if Rodgers would retire. Maybe he just does it at the same time. So with Bakhtiari, retirement's a question. How it affects Aaron Rodgers is a question. Are you competing next year is a question. And then do you want to take that risk on that knee, on that player, that he's going to make it through a year or two without issue, and you're willing to put at minimum $17.5 million on a 1-year deal on the line to do that? To me, the answer is unequivocally no. As much as it's painful, you have to move on from that, and you'd be better off spending that money on the next two guys that we're going to talk about. Even though Bakhtiari, as mentioned again, is the best player on this offensive line right now, bar none, no question about it. So it's a complicated conversation. It's a complicated topic. It's a complicated decision. To me, it's crystal clear of what needs to be done. I hate it. You hate it. We all hate it. It's just part of doing business, and it sucks. And it's complicated by the fact of the quarterback and the relationship that Bakhtiari has with the quarterback. All right. That brings us to Elgton Jenkins. At one point, this seemed like an absolute no-brainer. Elgton Jenkins, without question, would be back. They would get a deal done. This was an easy deal. Like, you're not moving on from a player that you drafted that was playing as well as Elgton Jenkins. And then torn ACL, lost for the remainder of 2021, comes back in 2022. You play him at right tackle. He's terrible. You move him back to left guard. He's okay, but doesn't look anything like he did prior to his ACL injury, which is very normal for players on their first year back coming back from an ACL injury. His knee is still bothering him very clearly, and he is going to be 27 years old in December. So it's not like he's he's not one of their young draft picks where it's like, wow, I can't believe Elgton Jenkins is still only 25 years old. He's 27 in December, will be 28 next year. And maybe the bigger issue here is that right now, ESPN just put out their list of top free agents next year. Elgton Jenkins is ESPN's number 3 rated free agent. I think that's probably a little bit aggressive based on how he's played this year. At the same token, offensive line play around the league is brutal, and finding a guy with the potential and ability of Elgton Jenkins is extremely rare. ESPN has him at number 3. He will see the open market because you can't really franchise tag him. You could, but you got to be confident you can work out a long-term deal with him, because you can't carry, with your salary cap situation, a 17.7 estimated salary cap hit for a guy in a franchise tag. They can't carry 17.7 for Elgton Jenkins next year. So they could franchise him, but then Elgton Jenkins and his agent get a ton, and I mean a ton, of leverage, because they would know that they can't have Jenkins going into the season on his franchise tag. So Green Bay would be well under the gun to work out a long-term deal with Jenkins, and Jenkins and his agent can play hardball and say, we want this guy. We want everything. We want one of the highest paid offensive lineman deals in football, or we'll just play on the 1-year franchise tag, which you can't afford. So it gives all the leverage to Jenkins and his agent. So you probably can't use that franchise tag. You would have to work out a long-term deal ahead of time, but his agent's not going to want to do that. because he's going to want to see Elgton Jenkins hit the open market, because there are going to be teams with ridiculous money to spend that can way outspend Green Bay, and some team is probably going to give him a massive deal. Last year, Brandon Scherff, at age 30, not as good of an offensive lineman in both of their primes, when both of them have been healthy and in their primes, not as good of an offensive lineman, and older. Scherff was 30 this year when he signed. 3 years, $49.5 million for Brandon Scherff. If I'm Elgton Jenkins' agent, that's probably like the start, like not even close to what I'm asking for to start with, because Jenkins also has experience playing almost every position on the offensive line, even though he was terrible at it at right tackle. They're going to say it was because of the ACL, and in his year coming back from ACL injury, there's going to be a decrease in play, and he should be back ready to play at 100% next season. So he hits the open market, and you could see some just stupid money flying at Elgton Jenkins that Green Bay, quite frankly, just wouldn't even be able to match. So that contract gets complicated by the fact that he's not playing as well since coming back from ACL. It's no longer just a shoo-in that Green Bay will want to pay him that amount of money. He's very likely to hit the open market. And if so, Green Bay's not going to be able to compete financially with teams that have a ton of money out there and may throw some ridiculous, stupid money at Elgton Jenkins. So the opportunity to lose him is probably better than we ever thought it was going to be. And this became a much more complicated issue. So, and even like, I think there was a time too where with Elgton Jenkins, we just assumed if Bakhtiari ends up having to not play again, well, Elgton Jenkins can just take over at left tackle, or Elgton Jenkins can play right tackle. That hasn't seemed to be the case anymore. It seems like he might just be a left guard now. And if he doesn't have that versatility, that limits some of his high-end value. And I will say this, and it doesn't matter all that much, but I do think even in his prime, Elgton Jenkins was slightly overrated. I think people had him as maybe a second team all-pro caliber player. I wasn't quite there. I thought he was really, really, really good. So it doesn't really matter. But part of what made him so great was the fact that you could plug and play him at 5 different spots on the offensive line. If that's no longer the case, he's still really good, potentially at left guard. If he can get back to the way he was playing, he's still really, really, really good. But I didn't quite have him in that all-pro caliber tier of guard, which is very well what he could get paid on or paid at this offseason on the open market, which again complicates things very, very much. Now, as far as his play this year, like I said, I thought it was really, really poor for the first handful of weeks when he got back. These last 3 weeks at left guard, I've had him graded in the positive every single one of those weeks. It hasn't been great, but it's been much better. And you are starting to see him gain more confidence in his legs. I thought his best game was this past week against the Titans. So he's starting to show signs that he's getting back into form, which is huge for Jenkins and his agent and his camp, but could ultimately make him more expensive on the open market. So this is a very complicated, problematic issue as well. That brings us to Yosh Nijman, who is also an unrestricted free agent. He's playing well right now. I actually have liked what he's done at right tackle, although this week I thought was a little bit tough against the Titans. We've seen him play left tackle. We know now he can play right tackle. What happens with Bakhtiari probably plays a factor here as well. Now, they could just say, hey, Zach Tom's going to be our left tackle of the future. I don't think they're going to have that level of confidence. So if Bakhtiari ends up retiring, or they do in fact release him or move on from him in some capacity, Yosh probably becomes a little bit more of a priority, I would think, in that situation. He's playing well. Pro Football Focus has him as their 49th rated offensive tackle. That's still a starting caliber tackle. It's a bottom tier starter, but it's still a starting caliber tackle. Like I said, I've liked some of the stuff he's put on tape at right tackle so far. He's going to be 27 in January. And like I said, he's really starting to come into his own. And there's an argument to be made that his best football might actually still be ahead of him over the course of the next few seasons. But he's the worst of the three. And he probably is what he is at this point, which is a fine starting tackle that you're not going to win because of, but you're not normally going to lose because of. He's fine. You can get by with him. And if that's the case, do you want to put a ton of resources into Yosh Nijman in the offseason? That becomes a question as well. If you want to look at potential contracts, I'm going to butcher this name every single time, but the Lions signed a couple years ago Halapoulivaati Vaitai to a 5-year, $45 million deal with the Lions. 5 years, $45 million. That was 2020. Vaitai had been a swing tackle for the Eagles and played kind of similarly to Yosh Nijman. And the Lions brought him in thinking he could be their future long-term starter at tackle. It hasn't worked out. He's still on the team. He's on IR. They've moved him to guard. It hasn't worked out. But at that time, he kind of had a similar trajectory as a swing tackle as Nijman did. And he got a 5-year, $45 million deal in 2020. Now, last year, La'el Collins, who I would have argued in Dallas played more snaps and probably played a similar brand, if probably not a bit better brand of football than Yosh did in Green Bay. La'el Collins last year with the Bengals got 3 years, $21 million to be their right tackle. I think you can make an argument that 3 years, $21 million for Yosh is fair market deal. But if I'm Yosh's agent, I'm looking at Vaitai's and saying, hey, 5 years, 45 sounds a lot better. And that's probably what I'm arguing for. So somewhere in there, 3 years, 21, you probably sign that right now if you're the Packers. 5 years, 45, or if it becomes in the $10 million range, which wouldn't shock me for Yosh, that becomes a much bigger question as well. And again, for kind of a average to below average starting caliber offensive tackle, that becomes a lot of money for that type of player, for somebody that's not going to get you over the top and be one of the reasons that you're actually winning football games. So all three, very complicated. There's no easy answer. And another question that you have to ask is just how many of these guys can they afford? Can they afford all three? I would say probably not. They probably have to choose between two of the three. They could probably make things work to get all three if they really wanted it, but that's really going to hamstring them to do anything else in the offseason. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning, this offensive line right now is playing okay. They're coming together a little bit, and they're showing signs that like they can gel together and be a satisfactory offensive line. But do you want to continue to pay David Bakhtiari a ton of money, pay Elgton Jenkins a crap ton of money, and pay Yosh Nijman maybe close to $10 million a year to go along with Jon Runyan Jr. and to go along with Josh Myers to be a okay average offensive line? That is a ton of money and resources to put into that. And again, we don't even know if this is going to be a team that's capable of competing in 2023. So, a lot of questions here. Just to kind of recap, is David Bakhtiari going to retire? Are you playing to win? How do you feel about your young players along the offensive line? Maybe they feel really good about Zach Tom. Maybe they feel good about a Caleb Jones or a Rasheed Walker. Maybe they feel a lot better about those guys than we do. I can't imagine that they feel great about Royce Newman, but maybe they think he can bounce back. Maybe they think Myers and Jon Runyan Jr. are going to take a major step. You know, we don't know how they feel about some of their young players or how they feel about some of the really talented offensive linemen in this upcoming draft. Maybe they think they can fix the issues with the draft rather than putting a ton of money into the position. We don't know how those decisions will affect Aaron Rodgers or how Aaron Rodgers' decision to play or not will affect their decisions on the offensive line. And if they can only afford one or two, which are the one or two that they're going to really decide to put their, to put the money in? These are all, like I said, extremely complicated, extremely difficult questions that they're not easy to answer. And they're going to shape this offensive line, this offense, and this team going forward. And how Green Bay handles the offensive line is going to tell us a lot about whether or not they're trying to win in 2023 or if it's going to get off to a rebuild. So a lot of decisions, Bakhtiari, Jenkins, and Yosh going to decide the future of this offensive line and where they go from here. I don't know. Like I said, my money is that they go in a different direction from Bakhtiari, but the Rodgers thing clouds that in a major way. I don't know that they're going to get in a bidding war to keep Elgton Jenkins. And Yosh is like, yeah, he's a nice player, but I don't know that you want to overpay for that brand of football player. So I'll let you guys have at it in the comments. Let me know what you think. I just want to say one more time, I love Bakhtiari. I would love to see him retire as a Packer in the future and keep playing amazing football. But you have to look at it from a dollars and numbers standpoint. And as much as Aaron Rodgers wants to say it's about the people, from a general manager standpoint, it's about making the best decision for the future of your franchise. and paying a crap ton of money to a guy whose knee is hanging on by a thread, probably not the best decision if you're using an analytical mind and using, like I said, putting your GM hat on, which is not always an easy thing to do because we love these players and we want to make the decisions with our heart rather than our mind. That's going to do it for me today. Always appreciate you. I'll be right back here tomorrow with a special Thanksgiving edition of the Pack-A-Day podcast. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.